Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Your commitment to advancing mental health care is truly inspiring. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us.
Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you're here. We have quite a presentation for you today. Thank you to everyone who have been commenting in the chat where you're from. We are so glad you're here. Kathleen from Maryland, Shayla from Nebraska, Vegas. Oh man, I want your weather. Oh, we're so glad you're here. We have a great presentation today on overcoming loneliness in recovery. And we have a guest speaker. We have 2 speakers with us today, so we're very excited. We have Kaylee Kron. She's a licensed master social worker and certified grief counselor. And as a grief counselor at a local nonprofit hospice, she's had the privilege of walking alongside grievers as a companion, uplifting each individual as the expert of their own story. And each person she met during this time confirmed to her that we grieve so much more than losses suffered through the death of a loved one. In each and every session, family grief session, support group, memorial event, she found that an individual's life is colored by grief in all forms: relationships, roles, hopes for the future, and changes to the story they believed about what their life would look like. So today, she continues her work as an author, public speaker, and community organizer of larger scale events, and they create space for each attendee to look back at life's most difficult moments and the pain that they felt and say that this is grief. She's been featured in articles, podcasts, community trainings, online courses, and magazines, giving voice to feelings of grief and expanding our community's understanding of the many losses that cause grief throughout our lives. So Kaylee, we're so excited to have you with us today to talk about overcoming loneliness and recovery journeys. And you have a special guest with you today as well, but I will let you introduce them, and I will hand the stage over to you now. So welcome, Kaylee.
Wow, thanks so much, Angela. And hi, everyone. It's great to see where everybody is popping in from. I personally am in North Idaho, so right next to Canada. And I am so thrilled to be here and working alongside Iconotes to just deliver a topic that I feel very passionately about. We're going to get into it in a little bit, but last year, I was planning a large event with my good friend, Eric Dorsa, who will be joining me a little bit later, about suicide prevention. And we wanted to talk about the root of suicide and where it comes from and why it comes, and kind of what is the start, what's the cultivation of that experience, and when we get to that point. And it really came down to elements of loneliness. And I think throughout that event, we focused on so many recovery communities, marginalized people. And it just really stuck out that loneliness occurs within all communities, and they're flavored in different ways depending on personal lived experiences, which is so important to take into account. The overarching theme that you will see throughout this webinar is that loneliness is a subjective experience. It is felt deeply by the person and can only really be described by that person. And so we'll go into that a little bit deeper, but for right now, I just want to say that loneliness is something that I'm very passionate about as a grief counselor, as somebody who has dedicated my life to working with individuals who are grieving. Much of loneliness is experienced and kind of mimics the experience of grief because, it's all about connection. So I'm so thrilled to be here. I, again, have been working in the social work field for about 10 years, and loneliness only recently really became a topic of discussion that I feel like we're all talking about now. And there's kind of waves. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but there's waves of topics of discussion. When I was in my master's program, it was a lot about adverse childhood experiences, trauma. Then we moved into, of course, during the pandemic, we had grief was a huge topic of conversation, which I appreciated quite a lot. And now we move into loneliness as something that we're really paying attention to, not simply as a result of the past 4 years, but it's certainly popping up more as a topic of conversation. So much so that the US Surgeon General has named it an epidemic of loneliness. This means that the Surgeon General, the guy who decides what's a big deal, has said loneliness is having a lasting impact, and it is incredibly widespread, and rates are going up. Whether rates are going up or we're noticing it more, we're assessing it more, and we're understanding it more, kind of, it's like a mixed bag. How do you know, chicken or egg? However, right now, we are noticing loneliness at an alarming rate. And when they studied loneliness and the effect on a human's body who's experienced long-term loneliness, they noticed correlations with increased chances of premature death by 26%. Lasting and long-term loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day on your physical health. It has been linked to heart disease, stroke, anxiety, depression, dementia, respiratory illness, and suicide. And so while all of these things are issues in and of themselves, when we zoom out and we really look at where is this all coming from, we can link loneliness to that. So the definition of loneliness, according to the Surgeon General, is defined as a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate meaningful connections, where inadequate refers to the discrepancy or unmet need between an individual's preferred connection and their actual experience. So all of that to say, I can't look at a person and how they live their life and what they do and say, that guy is lonely. That person is a lonely person, because they may not feel that way. They get to pick and they have to name it. And so when we're working with clients in sessions, we can't take an assessment of all the things they do in their life and say, well, to me, if I was experiencing that, that would be lonely. That's not a clinical assessment on someone's loneliness, because they have to identify that for themselves. And so we can walk alongside them. We can help them reach that conclusion and really pick apart their personal subjective experience. But there isn't specific markers necessarily that say, if you experience this, this, and this, you have to be lonely, because everybody is different, because their preferred level of connection varies. We do have, while we can't say this definitely makes somebody lonely, we have a couple of things that we can kind of earmark and say, okay, my client said this, this, and this, and that would indicate to me that they might be feeling lonely, which would trigger me to do more assessment in that direction. The first is actual connectedness is less than the amount of social connection that they desire. So they might say phrases like, I wish I had more friends. I wish I had deep friendships. I wish I had somebody I could really talk to and connect with. Like, voicing that they're unsatisfied with the level of connection that they have is one. Then we have lacking social participation, connection, and cohesion. Interestingly, I remember a study that we did back during our suicide event, and it was all about membership within communities and how a membership to something, a bowling league, a church group, things that you really feel like you are a part of is a big indicator of lack of loneliness, right? And then the last thing is when an individual reaches out for support for their loneliness, they're not successful. And the reason for that is the foundation of social connection isn't there. So you have somebody who lacks deep connection with another person in general. They reach out to people, but because they don't have that social connection, people don't really know what to do with those comments because connection is reciprocal, right? We also are lucky to have some assessment tools for loneliness. I think, as I said before, this is a relatively new thing that we're looking at through all of the articles I read, research that I did for this presentation. I just noted that for the most part, they say, we're working on it, we're looking at this, but we don't know everything yet because this is still very new. So what we do have are, just a collection of loneliness measurement tools, which can help you kind of figure out loneliness depending on a couple of factors. So the UCLA loneliness scale, I believe there's 4 versions of it. We do have on the handouts tab a breakdown of each of these with descriptions, how you would use any of these tools depending on the population, and then also what you're trying to find out in regard to loneliness. But the UCLA, I don't believe any of the scales are on iCanoes, no. And some of them are free tools and some of them are through a paywall. So you just kind of have to sift through and see, depending on the population that you serve, really dig into which tool works best for you. And it might be a collection of a couple. The UCLA one has been the most widely used. We also have the De Jong, which measures the emotional components of loneliness. Simple scale is just a 3-item scale. So if you just need a quick assessment, that's the one for you. If you work with children and adolescents, the loneliness and a loneliness scale for children and adolescents is really great because it has specific markers for childhood experiences. So you're not going to want to use an adult assessment on a child because their social connectedness, they're not the same markers. Of course, we also have the social and emotional loneliness scale, internet addiction, depending on the population, and then the friendship scale measures the depth of social connection with another person. So each and every one of those have been studied. They have efficacy and reliability, and so we only added ones that have been studied in general, but certainly with the boom of attention coming to loneliness, we're going to see more things come about. And, these might not all be the answer, but I think we kind of sift our way through this new study and these new tools to try to find what works best for us. And every one might be unique for the client that you're serving. This really brings us to loneliness in recovery communities. And again, as I said, we really looked at loneliness within marginalized groups. And one that really stuck out to me was the recovery community. And what specifically is it about addiction and loneliness? Where does that come from? And then when you're in recovery, loneliness and recovery. And then in that middle portion of when you are in active addiction. So there's elements of loneliness that mark throughout the journey from addiction to a recovery mindset. I wouldn't say that there's a destination there, but certainly when you're navigating recovery, there's loneliness components throughout. And so I was really intrigued by that. When we look at the onset of loneliness, so this is really interesting. It plays a key factor. Like we know, and we talk a lot about how our brain chemistry, our biopsychosocial, all of those contribute to the onset and development of addiction. But what they found when they looked deeper into loneliness, and this is based off a study that compiled 41 independent studies, they were longitudinal, and they looked at does loneliness play a factor? And they found that 79% of participants who were accessing treatment for substance use reported feeling lonely, and that 69% agreed that loneliness has been a serious problem. So they were able to identify loneliness as a key factor. They also showed within those studies that women and young people are more likely within that addiction community to be experiencing loneliness, which is really interesting. And when I read further into it, it talked about as you get older, you're forming more communities, and whether or not that's inside of addiction or inside of addictive behaviors, those communities form. And so as you get older, and especially in men, the loneliness goes down, but then of course pops back up in the older age for everyone across the board, not just within recovery communities. And then I think this is interesting, but not surprising, is that there's higher rates of loneliness with higher rates of substance abuse. So the deeper you are in your addiction, the more the addiction takes over many aspects of your life, the lonelier you become. And while we can think, oh, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? We don't know. We don't know the causal direction. And so it's interesting to note, and it's something for further study that has been identified with researchers on loneliness and addiction communities. We also, of course, have social factors. So I want us all to go back in our minds to our, high school years, middle school years, and the need to belong, the need to be a part of a community. Peer normative influences on the onset of addiction is huge. It is huge. Additionally, when you pair that with social isolation and a desire to belong to a group, dependent on what group you're desiring to belong to, you can get pulled into behaviors that spark addictive behaviors. And then if you also have that propensity for addiction, that becomes a long-term problem. But when we look at these factors of where does this even come from? Why did this even happen to this kid, but it didn't happen to this one? That's a long story, but we really want to look at that onset, and kind of that clicking on is the need to belong and not be lonely, not be isolated from our peers. And while we're going through this, when we look at kind of this timeline of the development of an addiction, living inside an addiction, and then coming through into a recovery journey, we have these identity markers where we are seeking out, building and losing, and then rebuilding identity throughout this process. And within each of those like movements of identity and formations of new identities, we gain and lose relationships. So depending on the depth of the relationships that we're gaining and losing, it impacts the trajectory and how long we sit inside each of these identities. So of course, when we're young, trying to figure out who we are, we want to belong. There's an identity of, am I a part of this group? Am I an in individual, or am I on the outside? And of course, we want to be on the inside. And so that part of our identity of figuring out how to belong. And I always say, my gosh, it's just learning how to be a person. We're just learning how to be a person. And that identity of belonging of, I'm going to like mimic what I'm seeing from my peers because I'm just learning how to be a human. I don't know how to do this yet. So then we have inside addiction. There's moments in time where your addiction impacts how people in your life who love you perceive you. And so you're traveling through, and this loss of positive identity, where potentially you attend family functions while using your addiction of choice. You engage in behaviors that aren't great in an effort to obtain your addiction of choice. The people that you love and the people you have social connections with, that impacts their feelings towards you, and then your identity of being a positive person gets shaken. It gets rattled. So then you have social isolation and gain of an identity with an addiction. So you kind of not, and this is not like definitely everybody sees you this way, but this is a personal internal experience. You have an identity of having an addiction. You are a person with addiction. And so in that way, you become socially isolated from those in your life who do not live with addiction. However, you become more connected potentially to people in your life who do have addictions. And so there becomes this relationship building within that. So then, of course, as we're traveling through, our hope is that the people that you lost along the way that were strong connections to a positive identity of, people say, I know you, this isn't you. Those relationships start to trigger a journey into treatment. And so the entering of treatment, being in treatment, becomes that formation of that first trigger of identity. So then we have the development of a recovery identity. Of course, you are traveling through, you're doing whatever program you enter. I think there's not a one size fits all there. However, throughout your time finding recovery, that becomes an identity in and of itself. Traveling further down the road, you have renewed identities. Who are you after your addiction and while you are in recovery and really working your programs? And then while you're in there, and I feel like we kind of oscillate, of course, throughout our lives of this renewed identity of who am I after my addiction, while also looking forward to who do I want to be now that my addiction hasn't overcome my life. And so all of these really surround identity and connectedness, and who within the identity, who are we trying to be connected with? And that identity of belonging comes back into play. So when they looked, there was a 2015 study that looked at groups of people who were participating in recovery activities. And what they found was that there's really similar social factors that contributed to, of course, the onset, but also the resolution of addiction, and how identity plays a large role within that. So first, they ask questions of what social identities and relationships do participants hold to their addiction. So what communities are they still a part of? What identities do they still hold on to? Like, for example, the fun person. Some people believe within their addiction, that's how they became socially connected. They were more outgoing and they liked that version of themselves to an extent. So that could be an example of an identity that they're still holding on to, regardless of where they're at within their recovery. The next is what factors are related to the onset and development of addictions and the initiation of treatment. So again, you have who were they connected to that brought them back into a space of recovery. And then how do participants' social identities and relationships change during treatment in the therapeutic community? So how are they rebuilding their social connections and their relationships with people inside of recovery? And then what is that aspirational identity that they have after leaving treatment? Who do they want to be once they are done? And so they looked at all of these and participants' answers, and they really tracked that social connection and identity became a large contributing factor to that continuation throughout recovery. As I said, there is a lot of need for more attention paid, not only to loneliness in general, but specifically loneliness within recovery communities and how social connection can pull individuals from addiction into a recovery space. So, of course, interventions that are targeting loneliness specifically are being developed, piloted, and tested. They're just in the testing phase, but they're trying. They're saying, in what ways can we engage these individuals in connectedness, like deep connections socially, that will help them on their recovery journey? And by no means would that be like the only intervention, of course, but we do need to look at that as reconnection. And then also, when we're looking at interventions, what are they doing? What's the point of them? So we look at looking at someone's perception of themselves. And again, we're talking about a subjective experience in which they are lonely, they have addiction, their identities play a large role. So then we turn that into how are they treating themselves and their perception of themselves? What support are they receiving? And how does that self-esteem play into this intervention? And so these are all things currently being studied at the moment. And of course, I believe very strongly that it's going to be more solid over time because we are only just now paying very close attention to it. And I'm very thrilled to introduce my good friend, Eric Dorsa. They are a mental health advocate and an individual who has been navigating recovery and really has dedicated their life to amplifying their experience while helping other people feel seen and heard. And I'm just constantly inspired, Eric, by your willingness to share personally what you have been through in an effort to help others. So thank you for being here. And I
Thank
would love
you.
you to share a little bit about your story as it relates to loneliness.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So my name is Eric Dorsa. My pronouns are they, them. I am so honored and excited to be here and to get to share this space with you all about overcoming loneliness because it is, I believe, truly a journey in recovery, like kind of alongside recovery from substance use disorders. So I am in long-term recovery from eating disorders and substance use disorders. I also say that I am a recovering, Southern kid who grew up in a very conservative, traditionally Mexican Catholic household. And so just listening to you talk, Kaylee, it was so validating. And I think something that really stands out to me in terms of my own journey is how much my recovery was centered in moments of being witnessed, not in moments of feeling like I needed to be fixed or moments where I feel like I needed someone to understand, but that truly these foundational moments in my recovery are when I was able to enter into spaces and community with people who just held up a mirror, were able to witness my experience and allow my experience to be valid for what it was, not needing an explanation or prerequisite, but just we see you and we get you. And so, especially talking about the statistics of lone people, of young people and loneliness, I can definitely say that was a huge experience in my formative years as a young queer Latino kid in South Texas, just feeling this sense of otherness from a very young age, feeling this sense of I'm not in the right body, in the right personality, in the right demographic. I'm not in the in group. And as I have learned working as a peer support counselor for many young people with eating disorders, that seems to be a very common thread, is somewhere really early in our stories, in the formative years of our lives, we pick up this messaging that something about us is incorrect. Something about us is too different. And I remember feeling this just innate sense of I'm not like the other kids. There's something about me that is wrong or incorrect. And that kind of became the breeding ground for shame. And what I've learned is like shame is a disconnector. It is a very primal, very all-encompassing othering of myself, or internalizing the shame of other people that they've put onto me as this way of being like, I cannot survive this level of isolation. And so growing up, I just wanted to be a kid who could cook in the kitchen like my grandmother and not have to mow the lawn because it was so gross outside. I mean, there were all of these little things that just made me not like my siblings, not like my brothers, not like the traditional, machismo Latin experience of growing up in South Texas. I was very much drawn to more effeminate things. And because of this, I experienced a lot of shame and isolation. Stop doing that. Why are you like that? Why can't you be like your brothers? Why can't you be like your siblings? And so there was kind of this sense of like my life and my livelihood is in danger because of me simply being who I am or wanting to like the things that I want to like. And so this otheringness of myself became a survival tool for me. I was having to sacrifice my authenticity and just my natural desires to want to be an innocent kid in order to quickly grow up and navigate that the world is not safe for someone like me. I was not allowed to embody my own body. I quickly was placed into what I call the war zone of my body because of how I sounded, how I moved through the world, the ways in which I walked down the hallway, or even something as critical as like reading out loud in class or having an opinion or using my voice in social conversations became such an excruciating, painful experience for me because of that otheringness, because of teasing or because of bullying or because of, threats of violence against me, or just the fear that it would bring up in my family when I spoke at a family function or when I had an opinion about anything. And so I felt like I cannot exist. There was something about me that just felt impossible. And so I always tell people I needed a drink. I needed an eating disorder. I needed a drink. I needed something to help me survive that reality long enough to get to a point where I could begin actually trying to break free from a lot of those systems of oppression, homophobia, transphobia, um, just to name two, though there's many, many more. And and so I think the biggest gift that I've learned in my recovery and being able to join recovery community is this idea that for so long I felt broken. For so long I felt fundamentally flawed. I felt inadequate. I had no way of voicing those feelings. They were buried so deep inside me from a place of shame. And when I finally began breaking free, I was able to voice that shame, but I had to face that shame. And shame is not something that is easily faced alone. I think it's actually quite impossible to face shame alone. And I just remember realizing through the experiences of others of being able to enter these spaces of community where recovery and our humanity was what bound us together. It wasn't about how much money you have. It wasn't about the color of your skin. It wasn't about what religion you belong to. It wasn't about your gender or your sexuality. Is in these recovery spaces, whether it's treatment or in my case, I didn't have money to access treatment. So I went through, the 12-step rooms, which are very well known for this addiction. I was able to recognize that I'm not broken, and needing to be fixed, that I am hurt and I need healing, that I've been invisible and I need to be seen, that I have been silenced and I need to learn to use my voice. And most importantly, that I was not damaged, that I was not damaged, and that my addiction and my experiences with disordered eating were the appropriate responses for the environment that I found myself in as a young kid. That there was no other way for me to cope or survive. And so this addictive personality that you talked about, this addictive identity was actually not something that I needed to be ashamed of or afraid of, but something that I needed help listening to. That there were very valuable experiences and very valuable pieces of my authenticity that I tried to smoke away, drink away, powder away, starve away, purge away, and that I didn't need to be afraid of my addiction anymore, but that I could learn from my addiction as what I call my friend with really bad ideas. And so I needed the experience of community to kind of be able to step into that space of neutrality with this very real, scared, angry, lonely, isolated young person who was just afraid to be seen, was afraid to take up space. The other key thing that I really want to talk about in terms of loneliness is the identity work. I spent so much of my early years, I would say most of my young adolescence, my preteens into my teenage years, and then into my young adulthood until I got sober at 26, running from myself and being so afraid to build any kind of meaningful connection. I felt like I completely lacked the skills to build any kind of authentic, meaningful connection. And for me, that was really rooted in a lot of religious trauma. As a young queer kid, we know who we are. We know, as young as I can remember, that there are things about me that are just quite different, and then different becomes dangerous. And I was fed this message that people like me, we go to hell, and that there's not a place, that we're sick, that we are lost, that we should be feared. It was never this loving embrace. It was always about isolation and shame. And so I remember growing up, what is the point of hoping, dreaming, envisioning a life or a future for myself when I get to the end, I'm just going to be alone and isolated away from the people that I love. So let me do everything and anything I can to try to fix myself. And the only tools that I ever learned was you do that through punishment. And I say that because coming into queer spaces of community and coming into queer spaces of recovery, that is the common thread. We felt like there was no point or purpose in trying to build any kind of meaningful or authentic life for ourselves. And so when I finally did have the courage to come out, I was met with a community centered in pride and a celebration when my whole life I had been marinating in so much shame and so much fear and so much disconnect from who I was. And nobody was talking about it. And so yet again, I felt like there is something wrong with me. Why can't I'm out. Why can't I find happiness? Why can't I find fulfillment? Why can't I find people to share in community? And it truly wasn't until, I guess you could say, my gift of desperation, that I really, truly wanted something different for myself, and that I entered the recovery spaces, queer recovery spaces, that I found my people who helped me grow up. I will say I am about to celebrate 10 years sober, and I'm just beginning to feel like I'm living my life. I feel like I'm just beginning to understand what it means to be a friend, be a partner, be a sibling, be authentic in my skin and with who I am, to really allow myself the vulnerability of holding on to hopes and dreams and allowing myself to feel the feelings. And it has been kind of this dismantling of who it is I thought I needed to be once upon a time for who I can be and who I know that I am, and giving myself, I think one of the most beautiful superpowers of recovery is living in the gray and realizing that I'm always a work in progress, and that my recovery really is centered in community. Some of the biggest markers of my recovery aren't in moments where I wanted to relapse. I would say I feel very fortunate that relapse is not a part of my experience. But in those moments where I had no idea who I was or what I was feeling, or how to even begin forming a sense of identity, and there was someone standing in front of me that says, just be here with me. I get it. Just be here with me. This is how you go back to college. This is how do you want me to go to the registrations office with you? This is how you get your first job. This is how you navigate moving to a different city. This is how you put your makeup on. This is how you show up for yourself, by learning to love yourself and realizing that you matter and that your presence makes a difference for someone else. And the thing that I am so grateful for is that recovery is centered in so much community. And I'll end with this because I want to make time for questions. I was taught that, but for the grace of God, meaning that the things that seemingly socially separate us are not what matter. That that the wisdom that it requires to navigate the powerful truth of addiction comes from everyone and anyone. And to really, I think that is a beautiful gift of recovery, is that I can look at someone and dismantle my own biases and my own fears and see myself in that person. And I really would say too, sometimes it can feel lonely in recovery because you're charting territory that nobody's done. I can say for myself and my family, but even as a queer person, being sober is not very common. Um, unless I'm in a sober room with other queer people. And even then, there's so many experiences of grief and loss that come from identity and fear, or having to start my life over in my 30s, losing my best friend to addiction. Because I think what's interesting in the loneliness piece is addiction is it's an epidemic, as we're seeing. I think even in the White House, it's an epidemic, but it's still one of the most lethal mental health conditions that is still penalized criminally, which is all about isolation and separation, which is also influenced by skin color, socioeconomic background. And so I think we do have a long way to go to see the humanity in people who are struggling with addiction, and not further separate them, shame them, or punish them, when really what the research shows and what I have experienced in my own recovery is the more connected, the more loved, the more affirmed, the more resourced, the less you will see addiction.
Wow. Yeah. Yes to all of it. Thank you so much for sharing that. And every time I hear you talk, I'm so compelled by like, how do you get from what A to Z so beautifully, speaking about your experience that, is such a deep part of your heart, and something that you continue to navigate every day. And something that really stood out to me that I want to like double click on a little bit is when you talked about your identity was rooted in brokenness when you were a little bean. And today you are a work in progress, which also kind of equates to I still got stuff to do. I still have things to fix. But the perception of brokenness versus work in progress potentially comes from the community, like the loving community that you found within recovery versus the community that caused you to feel quite broken when you were young. Can you speak to that at all?
Like the shift in the mindset. Yeah. Uh, gosh. Honestly, it, I think it's a miracle that any of us enter our first recovery space, because and as crazy as it sounds, our addiction is helping us survive. That perception that you were talking about, that perception of isolation or loneliness, that is rooted in reality for a lot of us. Mine was rooted in childhood trauma and just childhood, you know, ideologies that I had to believe in order to belong so I could get my needs met.
Mhm.
And I think that being able to enter those recovery spaces and hearing other people talk about their shared experiences. I was taught, listen for the similarities, not the differences. There will always be differences. I was taught, or I heard, pay attention to how people feel, not necessarily what is happening. Pay attention to the feelings, find that common ground. And in doing that, I realized quickly that I had a choice to make, which was, if I'm going to live, which I wanted to live, I just didn't know how to live, that I was going to have to start challenging my beliefs. And I think working in community with others and realizing that, like, wow, hearing someone else's experience and what they went through is very similar to mine. And yet, how am I able to hold this person with love, empathy, compassion, and curiosity? And I'm internally holding myself in judgment. And so it really became this teacher of like, I have to be willing to treat myself the way that I would treat others, and what world do I want to live in? And so it was just this very beautiful experience of taking my power back from those things. And I think being able to recognize that, like, there are certain things that I have to accept on faith. There's not really any proof. Like, is there proof that I'm broken or flawed or damaged? I don't know. Some in my family would argue absolutely. Being a fully self-actualized queer drag entertainer and LGBTQ activist living in New York City, they would look at that and, run for the hills. But then there are so many beautiful people who have helped me see the good in me and others. And so this is what I say. If believing the alternative, that I am flawed, broken, need to be fixed, leads me down a path of feeling sick, isolated, lonely, and afraid, then it's not God. And if believing that I am, like everyone else, a work in progress, worthy of being here just by being human, worthy of connection, that in this moment I'm sitting across a collection of people who are just wanting to do the best they can to stay sober. And that element of love inspires me and helps me be a better person, then that's God. And so I think about it in those terms. Like, which one gives life and which one tries to take it away?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I want to invite everyone in attendance. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. We have a little over 10 minutes left. And so I do want to ask specifically, you went through 12-step, right? And you continue to go 10 years later. And so I wonder, how does 12-step build community, and how do you, this is 3 questions. How does it build community to begin with? How does it reinforce those feelings of community when you are having a hard time? And then how do you reciprocate that community when others within your program are having a hard time?
I think from what I've experienced, and again, this is just my experience. There are many experiences. I just first want to say that, we are just people and people are not perfect. And so I'm very much like 12-step is not the only way to find community and healing. It's just what worked for me. It's what I had. And so I think one of the big things that it does to help form community is that it encourages a wide net. It says we are open to anyone. There's no real barrier to belonging, and there's no censorship on what is allowed to be, unless it's deemed harmful. But there's no censorship, and so I think that allows people to feel radically seen and heard. Like, I've been in meetings where people come in and they're like, I hate this place, I hate you all, and we're just like, thank you, like, keep coming back. I also think in terms of like how community has worked when I've needed it, is just knowing that it is there. I've experienced enough knowing that no matter what I'm going through, I don't have to go through it alone. I have seen, because I kept coming back, I have seen this community in action. So for example, when I lost my best friend of 10 years, we came in together to a relapse. I knew that the room wasn't going to make me feel better instantly, like the way that, a drug or a drink would have. And that wasn't where my brain was going, but I knew that I could go to that space and not have to hide anything. And the way that I give that community back is by doing my best to be the same for others. I think, I am sick, we recover is a saying that I run through my mind a lot. And also, I think what's really, really powerful about community is being able to give it away, understanding a sense of responsibility. I think that's another reason why the 12 steps work, is because it is so unorganized. These spaces are so unorganized. There's no hierarchy. There's no leaders. There's no group leaders, no facilitators. It's that you're just encouraged to get involved. And in that sense of responsibility, you see that part of being a member of a community and being in relationship with people is taking a responsibility to help meet your needs and their needs. That it is this kind of mutual power with, not power over or power under, but power with each other, that we're all kind of here together. And I think that equalizer helps you realize the strength of your own voice and the strength of your own ability to contribute.
I think, something that really stands out to me is the statement that you made, like, I found my people. That antidote to loneliness is community with others who see you, hear you, hold up a mirror. And I think that's really beautiful. I wonder if you could share a time when that you had like feelings of loneliness while in recovery, when your community really stepped up for you.
Yeah. I think, like most queer people, we really struggle with being able to reconcile our past and being able to kind of grieve the loss of who it is that we thought we needed to be once upon a time for love and acceptance and safety. And also then being able to kind of grieve the party life, that life that where we first experienced somewhat a taste of being in community, or I would say in my case, I experienced relief from the internalized homophobia and shame that I had. It was like, and I'll never forget when I was really feeling like so afraid to be seen, and I didn't know that's what it was. Like, I had developed, like most addicts, this very superficial, super extroverted, like I could work the room, I could read the room, but I didn't feel like I belonged in the room. And I was at my sponsor's house. He did a movie night for all the young queer kids, or we would watch like The Wizard of Oz or something, and just sit in community and eat pizza. And Celso just put their hand on mine and said, I'm really glad that you're here. And it may not feel like a family yet, but I want you to know that you will always be part of my family. Take as long as you need. And it was just that permission to be afraid, that permission to recognize that, like, I am here, but I don't know how to be here. That I felt like that was my community showing up for me. That I didn't have to force myself to fit. That I just fit. And I think about those moments all the time of just being able to hold that space for people is so powerful.
Absolutely. I think that really goes back to the idea of needing to belong, that desire to belong. And what I think sometimes we don't realize is those small moments are what help us feel a sense of belonging. We don't realize how powerful that is. We do have
A good question. I just read it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to? I'll read it just in case anyone didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
But first, I do want to share just a statement that was put in the Q&A. Eric, it says, "You are such a beautiful person. I'm so happy that you were able to find yourself. I appreciate you sharing your struggles."
Well, thank you.
So this question is from Marlene. When you mention family and how they may run for the hills, I wonder, for the discussion of loneliness, do you find family members trying to understand to keep that sense of family connection? I ask this due to the sense of family being so strong in Hispanic cultures. I wonder how to encourage young adults on how to keep that family bond while still finding their people.
I think it's different for everyone, obviously. For me, there was a lot of untreated addiction and mental illness in my family. And so I really I ran far away I ran equally to the other hills, okay, when it came to my family. Um, but it's a journey that I've made as a gift of my recovery. It's a journey that I've been able to make my way back to. And the way that I would describe it is I needed to find my people first. And I needed to be rooted in that radical love and authenticity so that I could grow so big and be so rooted in my values with my chosen family that now my family fits into my reality, instead of me feeling like I have to shrink down or completely disappear in order to fit into their version of reality. And that has allowed me to find things like love and forgiveness. And I'll never forget this experience. And I think it's important. I was so mad that my mother would not, that she would kind of go out of her way to provoke and attack my identity. And it was making, and I valued my family, and I had just this value of like, I loved my mother. It was at this point very, very frustrating. And my sponsor said to me, who is also queer, I know this is going to sound really hard, but you're wanting your mother to radically accept you, but can you radically accept her that she may never? Can you radically accept that, like, for whatever reason, those beliefs help her navigate life? Those beliefs help her do what she thinks is the right thing to do. And so I was like, I don't like you right now. I really don't like you. But it felt so real. It felt so open. And I think that's how I would encourage, anyone that I'm working with, or, anytime I share my story, is like, you need to do what you need to do for your own peace of mind and your own health and well-being. Like, addiction is very serious. And so if that means that you need to temporarily separate yourself because it is just harmful or just very triggering and uncomfortable to engage with, then you need to do that. Because part of Hispanic culture, as I experienced for myself, is when you're the one drawing attention to the problems, you kind of get gaslit into, why are you being the black sheep or the problem child, or your siblings aren't like this, or we tend to put the pressure or the problem solving on the person who is having the issue. And so I would say that does not work in recovery. Like, you need to do what you need to do to put your recovery first, and just be open to finding your way back to it. Be open to finding your way back to your people. It will look different, which is grief. It very much looks different for me. But I cannot have love without boundaries. Otherwise, it's chaos.
I was just thinking that of when you said I needed to find my people and get so big so that I could then invite them in. It sounded like boundaries.
Very much so.
Within that. So quickly, we have 1 minute. How did you get the energy to keep going? And how long did it take you to overcome your addiction? And how helpful do you think your sponsor was to you when he said, take your time? What did he mean?
Oh gosh. I would say that I was trying to get over my addiction the moment it started. So I started my addiction when I was seeking relief from my eating disorder, to be perfectly honest. My eating disorder had become so unbearable that, like, drugs and alcohol just kind of became this. It was like I was jumping from one sinking life raft to the next, trying to navigate these just very overwhelming feelings in isolation. But when I finally got into the rooms, and it was about a year. it was about a year of really showing up and being willing to listen to the experiences of other people, their suggestions. Like, they made my life very basic. They were like, when do you go to bed? Do you brush your teeth? Can you make your bed? Can you get to this meeting? They really taught me to put my recovery and therefore myself first, like put my own oxygen mask on. And um and that process took about, I would say, a little over a year to really feel comfortable. Like, oh, I felt progress. I didn't feel so much fear and anxiety, or that my addiction was just waiting for me in the parking lot. And I felt like I had friends and community at like kind of that year point. And I would say that like my sponsor saying that was when it really, really clicked for me, that it's not about doing, it's not about fixing myself, it's about allowing the truth of where I am to be enough. That like it kind of took me out of this black and white thinking, even for just a moment, so more seeds could be planted, that there was a right way and a wrong way. It's or that I had done something wrong. It was just like, you are where you are because that's where you are, and that's your authenticity. You don't need to be anything or anywhere other than where you are to be loved, to be seen, to be cared for. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to perform for it. You don't have to justify it. And I think that's what that, looking back now and being able to apply words to that moment, that's how I would describe that shift.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I want to echo everybody in the chat, just thanking you for your authenticity and just sharing your experience. And I just appreciate you so much for being here with me today and helping us really paint a picture from a lived experience. I think that that is so highly valuable to hear from a person who has gone through it, about loneliness. And so thank you for being here. And I hope you have a lovely day. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Kaylee.
Thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us. We're passionate